It all began on a night that seemed like any other. She entered the elegant restaurant alone, observing the crowd around her, unaware that this would be the turning point in her life. She sat down, ordered a glass of wine, and waited nervously. It was just another business dinner, or at least that's what she thought. But then he entered, the CEO of the company that had become the center of her career and, unexpectedly, of her heart. She never imagined that behind that arrogant gaze and imposing posture there was a man as vulnerable as she was. But he also didn't know what life had in store for them. What seemed like a simple exchange of words became the beginning of an unexpected story. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone who seemed so distant and unattainable became crucial in your life? Or perhaps you've experienced the pain of discovering that the man of your dreams might have a dark past. Then keep reading and share with us what you think would happen if you were in the protagonist's place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this one, full of surprising twists. Let's embark on this journey together. The meeting felt more like a business gathering. She, a young and successful marketing professional, was at a networking event in a luxurious hotel in the heart of Manhattan. Around her were familiar and unfamiliar faces, conversations about the financial market, new trends, and the challenges of the industry. It was exactly the kind of environment where she felt most comfortable, intense, focused, and with a demeanor that could often be seen as brusque. She wasn't one to play the friend. She had no patience for trivialities, and she avoided all kinds of empty conversation. Her objective was clear: to make good contacts and ensure that, at the end of the event, she would have some advantage. She wasn't there to flirt or be delicate. Her main mission was work. When he entered the room, everyone noticed. The CEO of the country's largest technology company. Tall, with an impeccable suit, piercing eyes, and a charismatic smile that seemed designed to win anyone over. He was, without a doubt, the most powerful person in the room, and his name echoed everywhere. But to her, he was just another arrogant executive, probably more interested in increasing his power than in establishing genuine connections. Fate brought them to the table together. She was arguing with another executive when he approached, interrupting with a nonchalant smile. "Excuse me, may I join you? I think this table is more interesting than the other one." He leaned slightly to greet her, but his hand was unceremoniously ignored. She didn't even bother to smile. She wasn't interested in pleasing or playing games. Her stance was clear. She was there for work, and he, like anyone else, didn't deserve her attention simply because he was famous. "You're the CEO of Quantum Tech, right?" she said, without looking at him, still focused on what she was discussing. "Well, I hope you have something substantial to add to this conversation. We don't have much time." He, surprised by the lack of cordiality, chuckled softly. Most people would be astonished by her directness, but he was different. He liked challenges, and that rude behavior was an enigma to him. "Well, you got me. I was just trying to figure out if you were more than just a pretty face among all the other executives," he replied, attempting to disarm her with a friendly smile. She stared at him coldly. "You have no right to judge me based on my pretty face. I'm here for what I can contribute, not for my looks." He felt the impact of her words, but he didn't let it shake him. Instead, he observed her more closely, feeling an unexpected attraction to her frankness and confidence. It was rare to find someone with such audacity, especially at an event like that, where everyone was concerned with image and how to please. The rest of the conversation remained tense, with her showing little interest and him trying with his charm to make the most of the situation. The meeting, which should have been simple, became a game of verbal shoves and furtive glances, but something was beginning to happen. He couldn't stop thinking about her, and the way she behaved without fear of being rude attracted him in a way he couldn't explain. She, on the other hand, began to realize that he wasn't like the other CEOs. There was something genuine in his gaze, a gleam that seemed to understand and even admire her aggressive posture. Finally, when the event was over, he found her again, alone at the exit. Without any warning, he approached her, his gaze more serious than ever. He extended his hand. "I know we weren't exactly friendly, but I'm interested in you. I want to get to know you better, on a more personal level. How about dinner?" he asked directly, without beating around the bush. She looked at him silently, and for a moment thought about refusing, about saying he was just another man trying to win her over. But something in his gaze made her hesitate. She couldn't explain why, but she decided to accept. "I accept, but understand one thing," she said, her gaze intense. "I'm not the type of woman who plays games, and you, CEO or not, need to be prepared for that." He smiled without losing his confidence, and did the only thing he could do at that moment. "I am prepared." She wasn't the type of person to be influenced by social conventions or the pressure to please. The 29-year-old had reached where she was because of her raw talent and her ability to assert herself in the market. However, behind her cold and direct demeanor, there was a woman with a deep fear of failure. Since graduating in business administration, she had sought to prove herself in the corporate world. Her parents always expected her to be one of the best, and she felt constant pressure not to disappoint them. Every step she took, every project she completed, was a way of affirming her worth to herself and to the world. She grew up in a New York suburb, where success was a constant expectation. Her parents owned a small family business, and she always knew that if she wanted a different life from theirs, she would have to overcome every obstacle. This shaped her, creating in her a strong character, but also a sense of incompleteness. The arrogance she displayed at social gatherings was nothing more than a defense mechanism to protect her heart. The CEO, on the other hand, had lived a very different life. He was the heir to one of the largest fortunes in the United States. His life, at first glance, seemed perfect. He had everything he wanted, every door open to him. But this ease also made him boring. There were no challenges for him, nothing that truly motivated him to be better. At 35, he already owned one of the most powerful companies in the technology market. His family saw him as the jewel in the crown, but inside, he felt an existential void. He didn't need more money, more power, or more recognition. What he desired, and what made him feel a tingling sensation, was a real connection with someone. When he met that woman, he knew she was different. She wasn't there to impress or please him. Her assertive demeanor, her impatience with social games, were something new, something he didn't know how to handle, but wanted to explore. He had always been the center of attention, and the way she challenged him fascinated him. The interest she aroused in him wasn't just physical, it was an attraction to something deeper. She wasn't dazzled. She didn't treat him like an untouchable figure. That intrigued him. He began to realize he needed to step outside his comfort zone, something he hadn't done in years. The way she challenged him without even trying, the fact that she wasn't submissive but equally determined, made him question his own choices and desires. He didn't want a woman who was his equal only in terms of status or success, but someone with whom he could share his frustrations, his insecurities, and perhaps his own flaws. That night, as he prepared for their planned dinner, he couldn't stop thinking about her. She made him feel somehow out of control. This disconcerted him and attracted him even more. Their chemistry was palpable, but not in the conventional sense of an easy romance. There was something more, something they both knew, even without wanting to admit it. They were about to enter uncharted territory. She, in turn, felt a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. As much as he was everything she avoided, there was something about him that made her want to give what he proposed a chance. She knew that if she got involved with him, the dynamic between them would be completely different from her previous experiences. He didn't treat her like just another woman dazzled by his fortune, and that was something that made her hesitate. But it also made her question whether she really wanted to continue being the woman who had always presented herself with an impenetrable facade. What he didn't know was that she was about to open up in a way she never had before. What she didn't know was that he, too, was on the verge of a major internal conflict, an irresistible urge to dismantle his own well-organized life for something riskier and more unpredictable. The dinner began calmly, but both knew they were on uncertain ground. She, with her always uncompromising demeanor, tried to keep the conversation casual, as if it were just another business meeting, another opportunity to discuss the market, new trends, and everything she knew by heart. But he wasn't interested in that. He wanted something more, something genuine, without the masks they both wore all the time. "Have you always been like this?" he asked with a curious smile, trying to steer the conversation towards a more personal topic. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the direct question. "What have I always been?" she replied, maintaining her composure. "Harsh, distant. You put yourself on a pedestal, distancing yourself from everyone. Why?" He seemed genuinely interested. She looked away for a moment, uncomfortable with the question. She wasn't used to being questioned about her choices, especially by someone she had just met. "I just don't have time for games. Life doesn't allow it." "You should know that," she replied, with a coldness that almost made the atmosphere around her seem denser. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "I'm good at business, at making people want what I offer, but I don't want to do that with you. I'm not just a CEO, and you're not just an executive, so what are you avoiding?" She took a deep breath. He had touched on something profound, something she had tried to hide. It wasn't just impatience with social conventions or a fear of being vulnerable. She was afraid of failing, afraid of opening her heart and being rejected. She had always been a woman of action, someone who didn't show weakness. But at that moment, looking into his eyes, she felt a vulnerability she didn't want to feel. "I'm not good at getting carried away," she finally said, trying to deflect the attention, but with a sincerity that was beginning to seep into her words. "And who am I to allow myself to? What's the point of getting involved if I know that in the end I'll just be another one in your collection of dates?" He smiled, but this time there was no arrogance, just a silent understanding. "I understand what you're saying, but you're not seeing me as I am, only as the image you've created in your head. I'm more than just the CEO of a tech company, and you're more than just a woman who thinks she has to defend herself from everyone." Silence hung in the air for a moment. The tension between them was palpable, but at the same time there was something more, a growing connection that neither of them had expected. She leaned back in her chair, feeling uncomfortable with the openness of the conversation, but also intrigued by what he was saying. He wasn't like all the other men she'd met. He wasn't trying to win her over with charm or empty promises. He was trying to understand who she really was. "You say that now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but unable to hide the lightness that was beginning to emerge in her posture. "But everyone has ulterior motives. In the end, do you want to take me to bed or take me to your empire?" He stared at her for a moment, his expression more serious now. "No, I want to get to know you, for real." She was about to crack a joke, brushing aside the vulnerability he seemed to have touched upon, but she stopped. Something in his gaze prevented her from doing so. She didn't know what he truly wanted, but she knew his words weren't empty. Something inside her was beginning to give way, to break down the barriers she had always erected. As the conversation continued, part of her remained alert, constantly looking for signs that he was just playing another one of his cards. But another part was genuinely interested, drawn not to the power he represented, but to the complexity he seemed to possess. He wasn't perfect. In fact, she knew nobody was, but something about him made her think that perhaps he was the exception. She had begun to open herself to the idea that he wasn't an ordinary man, but someone who, like her, was trying to find something deeper, Their relationship continued to develop, but the path was far from clear. The CEO, though determined to learn more about her, was beginning to find himself in an internal dilemma. He knew she wasn't the type of woman to be easily won over, which, in a way, challenged him even more. But there was a growing tension within him, a desire to connect with her, to be someone different from who he was on the surface. This made him uncomfortable because he had always known what he wanted, always been in control. With her, he didn't have that. However, there was more than just a growing attraction. The CEO was beginning to realize there was something deeper in his desire to know her, something that went beyond the physical or the pursuit of a superficial connection. She made him want to be a better person, more authentic, someone who wasn't just the man with the full bank account and the title of CEO. He wanted to be more than that, but he didn't yet know what that meant. Meanwhile, the protagonist also found herself torn. She was trying to stay focused on her work, but something about the CEO made her question her own choices. She, who had always been so dedicated to her career, was beginning to wonder if there was more to life than just achieving goals, meeting deadlines, and securing her position at the top. The fact that he was so direct, so genuine in his pursuit of something more, made her start to question herself. Was she neglecting her own happiness by dedicating herself too much to work? But there was another obstacle she couldn't ignore, and it stemmed from the past. For years, she had invested everything in her career, neglecting any possibility of getting involved in something deeper. She was so used to being independent that the ideas of love and vulnerability had become almost a threat. In fact, she had never allowed herself to be truly loved. The fear of losing herself in a relationship, of losing her power and control, had always been an immense barrier for her. Furthermore, the CEO wasn't the only man to approach her. Her professional life was on the rise, and this attracted the attention of many other executives and investors. Some saw her as a potential strategic ally. Others viewed her merely as another attractive woman in a male-dominated world. Among these men was an old rival, investor Carlos Sanchez, who, although lacking the CEO's power, wielded considerable market influence and a personal desire to win over the protagonist. Carlos had tried to court her on several occasions in the past, but she had always pushed him away without even giving him a chance to get to know her. However, with the protagonist's rise, he began to see in her an opportunity that could be more than just a business partner. He knew that by gaining her trust, he would have not only an asset in the market, but also a strategic position in her personal life. Carlos's undeclared interest was beginning to put the protagonist in an uncomfortable position. She didn't want her loyalty divided between two such different men with such distinct intentions. But at the same time, Carlos was willing to invest more time and energy to get what he wanted. What she didn't know was that the rivalry between him and the CEO was beginning to create an even more delicate situation for her. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her career, she knew her life was being dragged into a web of feelings and disputes she couldn't control. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the facade of a cold and rational woman. She was beginning to open up to the CEO, but at the same time felt drawn to her own independence and afraid to surrender herself. He, in turn, was beginning to realize that he couldn't maintain control over everything, neither over her nor over his own feelings. The situation was becoming increasingly complex. The pressure to make a choice, to decide between her and the more comfortable path, was mounting. But what he didn't know was that this dilemma wasn't just his. She, too, was trapped in a web of difficult choices. Meanwhile, Carlos was getting closer and closer, sensing that his opportunities to become involved with the protagonist were dwindling. He knew that to win this race, he needed to do something to make her trust him before it was too late. The night was quieter than expected. The CEO and the protagonist had met several more times since that dinner, but something had changed between them. They had progressed in their conversations, shared more of themselves, and were beginning to get to know each other in a way neither of them had imagined. The CEO, who was used to being in control of everything, found himself increasingly disarmed in her presence. She, in turn, was beginning to question the defenses she had spent years building around her heart. That night, he invited her to a private dinner at his house, away from the prying eyes of the city. The house, a modern and imposing building, was a reflection of his life, large, cold, and perfectly organized. She arrived punctually, her heart beating faster than usual. It wasn't just the anticipation of the dinner, but the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. She met him at the entrance with a smile that this time seemed more genuine. It wasn't just the smile of a man accustomed to being adored, but the smile of someone who was actually interested in getting to know her. "It's so good you came," he said, with a twinkle in his eye. They sat down at the table, but soon the conversation strayed from business and the banalities of daily life. He spoke of his fears, something he rarely did. He spoke of the loneliness he felt, of how his success had distanced him from everything that truly mattered. She, in turn, seemed to listen more attentively than usual. She was beginning to see the man behind the CEO, something she hadn't expected to find. But then the door opened and the tranquil atmosphere was shattered. Carlos, the rival investor, entered unannounced, bringing with him a tense energy that immediately altered the mood of the room. He wasn't there by chance. "Excuse the intrusion," Carlos said with a calculated smile. "But I have something important to discuss with you both." The CEO stood up immediately, his expression turning stern. "What are you doing here, Carlos?" Carlos didn't seem intimidated. Instead, he addressed the protagonist with a look that clearly challenged her. "I think it's time you learned some truths about your friend here," he said bluntly. "This man isn't what you think. He has secrets, and those secrets could ruin everything you're trying to build." The protagonist looked from Carlos to the CEO, her gaze becoming suspicious. She didn't know what was happening, but she sensed that something big was about to be revealed. The CEO, for his part, was visibly shocked. He looked at her, trying to understand what Carlos meant, but he knew that the revelation that was about to occur could destroy everything. He had carefully built his life, hiding parts of his past that were now about to be exposed. "Carlos, don't do that," the CEO tried, his voice thick with frustration. But Carlos had already taken an envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "I know you don't want her to find out, but I have no choice. If you weren't honest with her, now you'll have to face the consequences." The protagonist remained silent, her eyes shifting from Carlos to the CEO. She knew something was wrong, something he hadn't said. He always seemed so genuine, so open. But now she saw a wall of secrets between them. Carlos smiled, noticing her reaction. "Do you think he would really care? He has a past he doesn't want anyone to know about. He manipulated everything around him to get where he is." She stared at the envelope, her thoughts becoming confused. "What does this mean? What's going on here?" Her voice was more tense now, her confidence in the CEO beginning to waver. The CEO could no longer hide the truth. He looked into her eyes, knowing this moment had arrived. "Carlos is right. I didn't tell you everything, and I know this will disappoint you. But I didn't want you to see me only for who I was in the past. I wanted you to see me for who I am now." He stood up, walked over to the envelope, and handed it to her. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, her fingers trembling. What she found took her breath away for an instant. Inside the envelope were documents and photos linking the CEO to illicit activities, something he had kept well hidden. A series of shady deals, money laundering, and even involvement with questionable figures in the corporate underworld. She looked at him, her emotions shifting from shock to anger. "How long were you going to hide this from me?" Her voice was firm, but full of pain. "You're not the man I thought you were." He remained silent, unable to find words to explain or justify his choice to hide his past. What he feared most was happening. She saw him as he truly was, not as the man he tried to be. The silence following the revelation was crushing. The protagonist stared intently at the CEO, her hands trembling as she held the papers before her. What she saw left her stunned, but at the same time a part of her already knew there was something behind the perfect facade he presented. She had seen that glint in his eyes, that sincerity that now seemed so empty. Everything she thought she knew about him crumbled before her, and the trust she was beginning to build vanished in an instant. Carlos watched the scene with silent pleasure. He knew the truth would always come out, and he was simply acting as the messenger. His goal wasn't just to bring down the CEO, but also to win the protagonist's trust, which was now clearly shaken. He approached her, trying to capitalize on the moment. "I know this must be a surprise, but if you want, I can help you understand what happened. You deserve to know the truth, and I'm the person who can show you what he really is," Carlos said in a soft tone, trying to seduce the protagonist with his words. She ignored him. Her focus was on the CEO, who still stood there, unsure how to react. The atmosphere, which had previously seemed comfortable, was now thick with tension. She looked at him, expecting some explanation, a justification, but he seemed unable to offer more than a blank stare and heavy breathing. The CEO knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't want you to find out like this," he began, his voice tense. "Yes, I am what you saw there, but I'm more than that too. I've changed. I was trying to be a better person, and I thought that if I told you the truth, you wouldn't see me the same way. I didn't want to lose you." He paused, as if the words he was saying were more difficult than any corporate speech he had ever given. He wanted her to understand, but he knew it was too late to apologize now. "You lied to me," she replied, the pain in her voice as clear as day. "You lied about who you are. You lied about everything. I gave you a chance because I believed in you, and you made me believe what you wanted me to see, not reality." She stood up abruptly, leaving the papers on the table. The anger boiling inside her was visible. It wasn't just about the lie, but about the feeling of having been used, about the feeling of having been blinded by a charm that now seemed empty and manipulative. "What do you want me to do with this? How do you expect me to trust you now? After everything I've seen?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unanswered. She hadn't expected him to have an answer. She hadn't expected him to have enough words to fix what was broken. The CEO, who had always been in control of situations, now found himself lost. I couldn't control anything anymore. He had laid his cards on the table and, in doing so, had lost the game. He knew he could no longer ask her to forget all this. The consequences were upon him, and he didn't know what would come next. Carlos, seeing the scene unfold, approached, offering one last chance. "You don't need to stay in this mess. I can help you see things more clearly. He doesn't deserve your trust. I'm the only one here who can give you what you truly deserve." He was trying to reverse the situation, but she looked at him as if he were a stranger. Her eyes were no longer on him. All she could think about was the man she had begun to see differently, but who now seemed like a distorted version of everything she wanted. The CEO no longer had the power to convince, to win her over. He had lost the respect she had for him. She took a step back, a feeling of disappointment growing in her chest. "I need some time. I can't do this right now. I can't be here with you." She turned and left the room without another word. The sound of her footsteps echoed as she walked away, leaving behind an environment that had once seemed so safe. The CEO stood there, unsure what to do, feeling the weight of the loss. He knew that now he had another battle to fight, and this one would not be easily won. Carlos watched the scene, smiling subtly. He knew the battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. The silence in her apartment was deafening. After the CEO's past was revealed, she had distanced herself from everything and everyone, immersed in her own thoughts. The phone, which used to be a reflection of her busy life full of commitments, was silent. She didn't want to talk to anyone, not even those closest to her. The pain of betrayal still consumed her, but there was something else, something she couldn't ignore. A growing feeling that what she had experienced with the CEO couldn't be erased so easily. She knew she needed to make a decision. It wasn't just about the CEO or what he had done, it was about herself, about what she wanted for her life going forward. The woman who had previously only cared about her career and the perfect image she had built around herself was now at a crossroads. She felt that if she continued with this wall of self-sufficiency and control, she would never be able to allow herself to be vulnerable again. But at the same time, she was afraid to trust someone again, afraid to be broken a second time. The phone rang, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. But something inside her made her answer. It was the CEO. "I know you don't want to talk to me," he said in a voice softer than she had heard him before, "but I don't know what to do. I can't leave all this behind. I can't be who I was anymore." She was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. He was finally admitting what she needed to hear, that he too was breaking down over everything that had happened. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she replied, her voice wavering. "I still don't know if I can see you the same way. I feel deceived." He sighed, as if preparing to face something far greater than anything he had faced before. "I understand, but I need you to know that the person you knew is no longer who I am. I was someone who thought power was everything. I thought that if I kept everything under control, I wouldn't have to deal with the pain. But you made me see that it's not like that. I'm not perfect. I never was. But what I can guarantee you now is that if you give me a chance, I will fight for you, not for who I was, but for who I want to be, with you by my side." She felt something stir within her upon hearing those words. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, but also a piece of hope she had kept for herself, a hope that she could indeed allow herself to be vulnerable without losing herself. But at the same time, she knew she would have to confront her own insecurities, her own fears. She couldn't continue living in a state of denial, of self-sufficiency that isolated her from any kind of real connection. She sighed, placing her hand on her forehead, trying to organize her thoughts. "I can't just forget what happened. I still don't know what to do with all of this, but I can't just stand here anymore, waiting for things to resolve themselves. I need to change too." He listened in silence, understanding that she was taking the first step. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she was ready to change, to make space for the situation to be resolved, for her to rebuild herself. "I don't expect you to forgive me now," he said finally. "I just need you to know that I'll do everything I can to deserve a chance at a fresh start. I'll be the person you need me to be, if that's what you want." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were both ready to grow, to change, and to try something new, together or apart. She knew the path wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to face it. The next morning, she woke up with a different feeling. The pain was still there, but it wasn't the only thing she felt anymore. There was a new kind of determination in her soul. She knew forgiveness wouldn't come immediately, but she also knew she couldn't keep living in the past. Forgiveness, whether for him or for herself, would be a process. But somehow, she was ready to begin. Time passed, but the tension between the protagonist and the CEO still lingered, even though both were trying in their own way to move on. She had decided she needed to take an important step in her life. It was no longer about the CEO or any other man, but about herself. She needed to regain trust in her own choices, take back control of her life, and above all, open herself to the future without letting the past dictate her happiness. She returned to her work, to the projects that had always been her priority. But something had changed in her approach. Now she allowed herself to be more open, more flexible, more willing to take risks. The fear of getting involved with someone, of placing her trust in another person, was still there, but she knew she couldn't live her life with an impenetrable suit of armor. Meanwhile, the CEO was in a state of deep reflection. He knew he couldn't expect her to forgive him immediately, but he also understood that to rebuild trust, he needed to show concrete actions, not just words. He began making decisions that reflected his intention to change. He was walking away from some of the old business arrangements that had put him in the position he was in. He was making changes in how he ran his company, and most importantly, he was seeking help to deal with the traumas of his past. He wanted to be a better man, not just for her, but for himself. However, the change was not simple. He was facing resistance within his own company. His partners, who had benefited from his ruthless approach and the dubious partnerships he had cultivated over the years, were unwilling to accept these changes. They saw his attempt at redemption as a threat to everything they had achieved. They knew that if he truly followed his new path, their professional lives would also be altered. They wanted to keep him in the old mindset of power, control, and profit at any cost. And the main source of pressure came from within his own home, or more specifically, from his company. His biggest rival, Carlos, had begun to strategically move to occupy the prominent position the CEO was opening up. The investor knew that the only way to truly defeat the CEO and take control of the situation would be to remove the protagonist from the equation. He was beginning to approach her again, trying to use the information he had learned about the CEO to manipulate the situation and make her an ally. Carlos wasn't just interested in winning her heart, but also in bringing down the CEO, and he knew the best way to do that was by feeding her insecurities, convincing her that the CEO's change was just a facade. He began sowing doubts in her mind, using the fragility of the situation to position himself as the best option. Meanwhile, the protagonist was beginning to realize Carlos's intentions. He wasn't trying to be her friend, but merely to manipulate her as a pawn in his game. She knew she needed to make a decision, not only about the CEO, but also about the kind of person she wanted to be. One who allowed herself to be deceived, or one who faced the truth, even when it was difficult. In a moment of clarity, she realized she could no longer postpone the decision. She would need to confront the CEO, but she also needed to confront herself. What did she really want? Was she willing to risk her heart again? She knew he had changed, but the fear of losing her again paralyzed her. But, on the other hand, she knew that without taking this step, she could never know what could truly be. She called a meeting with the CEO, and he knew the moment to confront her had arrived. They needed somehow to decide what to do with the feelings that still remained between them. He wholeheartedly wanted to show her that her transformation was real, but he knew that, for that to happen, she would have to trust him again, and that meant he would need to be completely transparent, hiding nothing more. When she entered his office, the look in her eyes said it all. There was tension, but also a sense of purpose. They were about to face whatever was coming, whatever the outcome. He knew that this time he could no longer evade the consequences of his actions. It was time to make a choice. The office was silent, except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, marking each tense second. She entered with firm steps, but her heart was racing. The soft light streaming through the window reflected on her skin, making the moment almost surreal. She knew something big was about to happen, and the words she chose would be crucial to both their futures. The CEO stood watching her, his expression a mixture of anxiety and regret. He knew this was the defining moment. If she didn't accept him now, if she decided he didn't yet deserve her trust, he would have to live with that. But if she chose to give him a second chance, their lives would take a completely different turn. He was ready for whatever decision she made, but not before making one last attempt. "I know everything I did to get here was wrong," he began, his voice deeper than usual. "But if you give me a chance, I can show you I've changed, that I'm ready to be someone different, someone you deserve, not the man I was before." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on hers, trying, once again, to communicate without words. It was a risk, he knew, but he could no longer hide the truth. He could no longer run from who he truly wanted to be. She watched him, his face impassive. She didn't want to be frivolous. She didn't want to be the woman who believed in empty promises again, but on the other hand, she couldn't deny what she felt. His change, however doubtful, seemed real. She had seen the effort, and more importantly, she had seen the genuine pain in his eyes. The pain of someone who knew his past actions had consequences, but was still willing to face their weight. "You made me believe, and you made me feel I could trust you. But I don't know who you are anymore. You were a lie to me the whole time, and I was foolish enough to fall for your illusion," she said, her voice trembling. But there was something else in her eyes, a vulnerability she couldn't hide. "I wanted to believe you were changing, but how can I be sure this isn't just another facade?" He felt the weight of her words like a sharp blade. The pain she felt was reflected in her face. He knew she was right. He couldn't simply ask her to forget everything she had done, and he could no longer run from his own truth. But what he wanted more than anything was a chance to prove that he was no longer the man she thought he was. "I know you're afraid," he said, his voice now softer, more vulnerable. "And I'm afraid too. But more than fear, I want you to know that I will fight for you if you give me a chance. I don't want to be the man of the past anymore. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone." A heavy, almost unbearable silence stretched between them. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to believe him, but the other part feared what might happen if she were disappointed again. But what she felt, what she knew, was that if she didn't make a decision now, she would never know the true depth of her own emotions. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, she took a step forward, closer to him. Her hands were trembling, but she kept them firmly at her sides. She didn't know what the future held, but she could no longer live in doubt. She needed an answer to her own questions, and that answer could only come from a choice, a decision made with her heart, not with fear. "I can't promise you anything, not even that I'll forgive you immediately," she said, her voice calmer now. "But I'll give you a chance, and you'll have to prove, every day, that you've truly changed, that you're worth my trust." The CEO looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that at that moment he had the opportunity to show who he really was, and that meant more than any success or power he had ever achieved. They remained silent for a few more seconds, the words hanging in the air. But instead of drifting apart, something else formed between them, a possibility. The chance to start over, to build something real. He stepped forward carefully, and then, as if the world had stopped, he gently pulled her into a hug that, though silent, said everything that words could not express. Time passed, and with it, the rebuilding of everything that had been broken. The trust, which had previously seemed so fragile between them, now blossomed slowly but strongly. The protagonist didn't know what the future held for them, but something inside her told her that, unlike before, she was no longer alone on the journey. The CEO, in turn, had committed himself to being a better person, not for her, but for himself. He dedicated himself entirely to showing that the change was real. The old way of doing business was replaced by a more transparent approach, where ethics and respect for others became fundamental. He had distanced himself from old allies, those who were still clinging to power and manipulation, and now surrounded himself with people who shared his vision of a more honest corporate world. Although challenges remained, he was ready to face them with integrity. She, in turn, felt she had freed herself from something that had previously seemed like a burden. The fear of trusting again, the shame of having been deceived. And by taking the risk of giving the CEO a chance, she also gave herself an opportunity to rewrite her own story. She no longer needed to be a cold and controlling woman. She could be vulnerable, open to the possibilities that life still had to offer. Together, they had begun to build something new, more solid and more genuine. On a quiet night, after months of rebuilding, the CEO and the protagonist met again at the same restaurant where their story had begun. The table where she had first sat, filled with uncertainty, was now marked by memories of laughter, sincere conversations, and moments of affection. The CEO looked at her with a genuine smile, unhurried, unafraid. He knew that, regardless of where the path led them, the important thing was that right there at that table, they were finally building something real. "I know we still have a lot to learn about each other," he said, gently holding her hand. "But along the way, I know that with you, I can be the person I've always wanted to be." She smiled, feeling the warmth of that hand in hers. "Me too. And I know that together, we can face anything." The future was uncertain, but for the first time the fear of disappointment was no longer greater than the hope for something new, something real. As the city lights twinkled in the background, the two sat there, sharing a moment that symbolized true change, not just between them, but within themselves. Their journey was only beginning, but now there were no more secrets, no more lies. There was only the promise of a new beginning. Months later, the protagonist and the CEO were stronger than ever. They had overcome the obstacles, and although the scars of the past were still there, they were now part of a story they had rewritten together. The company, now more ethical and fair, had become a model for others, and they, more than business partners, were truly life partners. On a sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the park, he pulled her into a hug. She smiled, knowing that no matter what the future held, together, nothing could destroy them. So what did you think of this story? Did the CEO really change, or was it just a facade? What would you do in the protagonist's place? Leave your opinions in the comments and share with your friends so they can also follow this journey of redemption and love. Don't forget to subscribe for more exciting stories like this one, where each twist takes you deeper into the characters' emotions. What does the future hold for them? Let's find out together.